Looking back now, I can pinpoint exactly when my life split into before and after. I was 16 when my parents sat me down in our small living room and told me they were getting divorced. No drama, no screaming matches, just two people who'd fallen out of love and wanted different things in life. I remember being surprisingly okay with it. Maybe because they handled it so maturely, or maybe because I'd seen it coming in the small ways: fewer family dinners, parallel lives under one roof. Dad moved into a nice apartment across town, and I spent every other weekend with him. We'd order pizza and watch bad sci-fi movies, just like we always had. But then Mom met Robert. Just a year after the divorce, she came home practically floating. "Lucy, I've met someone special," she announced over breakfast. "He's got a daughter about 10 years old. Wouldn't it be nice to have a sister?" I forced a smile and pushed my cereal around the bowl. "Great, Mom. Really great." Within months, they were married, and Robert and his daughter Sarah moved into our house. That's when the trouble started. Sarah, with her designer clothes and perfect little girl curls, looked like an angel in front of the adults. But the moment they turned away, she was a different person. It started small, my favorite sweater somehow ending up in the washing machine with red socks, my homework mysteriously getting coffee stains. Robert wasn't much better. He'd make little comments, always just on the edge of rude. "Lucy, don't you think that skirt's a bit short for school?" he'd say. "Or maybe if you spent less time on the phone and more time studying, your grades would be better." I tried to tell Mom, but she'd just say, "He's just protective, honey. He wants what's best for you." Then came the research project incident. I'd spent weeks working on it: interviews, data collection, everything. I came home from school early one day and found Sarah in my room, her hands stained green from the markers she'd used to destroy my work. Pages and pages of research, ruined. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, grabbing her by the collar of her expensive little cardigan. "Nothing," she squealed, but the evidence was all over her hands. I dragged her downstairs to where Mom and Robert were watching TV. "Look at her hands," I shouted, pointing at the green stains. "Look what she did to my research project." Robert jumped up, his face turning red. "Get your hands off my daughter. She destroyed my work. Weeks of work." "You little fool," Robert snarled, stepping toward me. "How dare you manhandle my Sarah? She's just a child." I looked at Mom, waiting for her to defend me, to say something, anything. But she just sat there, shaking her head disapprovingly at me. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mom's silence over and over in my head. By morning, I'd made my decision. I started packing before sunrise, throwing clothes and books into bags, not even caring if they were folded. Dad picked up on the first ring. "Lucy, what's wrong? Can I come live with you?" My voice cracked. "Please?" "Of course, sweetheart. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Dad's truck pulled up, Robert was already at work, and Sarah was at school. Mom stood in the doorway, watching me load my bags. "Lucy, don't do this," she said. "You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" I turned to face her. "Your husband called me a fool, and you just sat there. Your stepdaughter destroyed my work, and you did nothing." Dad must have heard, because his face darkened. "What's this about Robert calling my daughter names?" After I told him everything, he was livid. He marched straight to Robert's workplace. I stayed in the truck, but I could see them through the window of Robert's office, Dad pointing, Robert standing up, faces red, fingers jabbing. Security had to separate them before punches were thrown. Living with Dad was like breathing fresh air after being underwater. No more walking on eggshells, no more checking my room for sabotage. He helped me redo my research project, staying up late with me, bringing me coffee and snacks. Mom sent me a message a few days later. "I can't believe you set your father against Robert like this. You're tearing this family apart." I didn't bother responding. What family was she talking about? The one where her husband verbally abused me? Where her stepdaughter destroyed my things? I focused instead on finishing my senior year strong. When graduation came around, Dad and Grandma sat in the front row, cheering louder than anyone. Mom was there too, with Robert and Sarah, but I barely glanced their way when I walked across the stage. "We're so proud of you, sweetie," Grandma said afterward, hugging me tight. "And we've got a surprise. Your father and I have been saving for your college fund." They'd saved enough to cover my tuition at the local college. I moved into the dorms that fall, ready for a fresh start. A few months into my sophomore year, Mom reached out on social media. "I'm sorry about everything that happened. Can we talk?" I agreed to meet her at a cafe near campus. It was awkward at first, both of us stirring our coffee too long, avoiding eye contact. "Sarah's starting to look at colleges," she said. "And Robert just got a new car." "That's nice," I said, then quickly changed the subject. "My psychology professor thinks I should consider grad school." We fell into a routine after that, monthly coffee meetings where we talked about safe topics, the weather, my classes, her work. She'd try to slip in mentions of Robert and Sarah, but I'd steer the conversation away. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. After graduation, I landed a job at Marshall & Associates as a junior project manager. Dad was thrilled and immediately offered me a place at his apartment. "You could save money, Lucy," he said over dinner. "No need to rush into renting." I shook my head, pushing my pasta around the plate. "Thanks, Dad, but I need to do this on my own. I found a small place near work. It's time for me to stand on my own 2 feet." The apartment I rented wasn't much, but it was mine. The first night I spent there, sitting on my second-hand couch with takeout Chinese food, I felt more grown-up than ever before. Every month, I put aside a chunk of my paycheck into my future house fund. While my coworkers went out for expensive lunches, I brought sandwiches from home. When they hit the bars after work, I stayed late, tackling the projects nobody else wanted. "Parker, the client's impossible," my colleague Jake warned when I volunteered for the Riverside account. "They've gone through 3 project managers already." I just smiled. "Watch me." 3 months later, the Riverside project was completed ahead of schedule. My boss called me into his office, looking impressed. "Lucy, I've got to say, you've exceeded all expectations," he said, sliding a bonus check across his desk. "Keep this up, and you're going places in this company." The quarterly bonuses started rolling in, and they weren't small. Every cent went straight into my savings account. My coworkers thought I was crazy, passing up happy hours and weekend trips. "You're wasting your youth," Mom said during one of our coffee meetings 2 years later. "You should enjoy life a little." "I am enjoying life," I replied. "I'm building my future." She stirred her coffee absently. "Sarah's joining a sorority at her college. Having the time of her life." I changed the subject. "The weather's been nice lately." The only times I couldn't avoid Robert and Sarah were at family gatherings, Thanksgiving at Aunt Paula's, Christmas at Uncle Mike's. I'd walk in, hug Mom, and pretend they didn't exist. Sarah, now in college herself, shoot me smug looks. She'd grown taller, more polished, but that mean streak was still there, just better hidden. Robert would stand with his arms crossed, looking down his nose at me. Still at that entry-level job, he'd say loud enough for others to hear, even though he knew I'd been promoted twice already. During last Thanksgiving, I was helping Aunt Paula in the kitchen when Mom cornered me by the refrigerator. "Lucy, don't you think this has gone on long enough?" she sighed. "Sarah's grown up now," Robert's mellowed. "Can't we just be a family?" I closed the fridge door harder than necessary. "We're not a family, Mom. We're people who happen to be connected by your marriage. That's it." "You're being childish," she said, shaking her head. "People grow, people change." "Yeah, they do," I replied, looking her straight in the eye. "I've grown enough to know I don't need toxic people in my life, even if they're technically family." She opened her mouth to argue, then just shook her head and walked away. Same old mom, always choosing the path of least resistance, always walking away from confrontation. But every snide comment from Robert, every smug look from Sarah just reinforced that I'd made the right choice in keeping my distance. The day I turned 28, I signed the final papers on my house. After years of saving and working overtime, I'd managed to put down 60% of the total cost. The mortgage payments wouldn't keep me up at night. "Congratulations, Ms. Parker," the realtor said, handing me the keys. "It's a beautiful property." Standing in my empty living room that first day, I felt like I could finally breathe. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard where I could plant a garden. All mine. I planned a housewarming party, sending invitations to family and close friends. Dad and Grandma couldn't make it, they'd recently moved to Hawaii for Dad's retirement. When I called Mom to invite her, I was specific. "I'd love for you to come, Mom." "Just you?" She hesitated. "Lucy, that's not fair to Robert and Sarah." "Mom, it's my house. My rules." She agreed, but I should have known better. The day of the party, I opened the door to find Mom standing there with Robert and Sarah in tow. "Surprise," Mom said weakly, noting my expression. I bit my tongue and let them in. Robert's eyes scanned everything, his lips curling slightly as he took in the crown molding, the hardwood floors. "It's nice," he said, making it sound like anything but. Sarah, now 22 and dressed like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, wandered around with her nose in the air. "The kitchen's kind of small, isn't it?" I was showing my colleague Jake the back patio when I overheard Sarah talking to Mom and Robert in the living room. "Daddy, I've been looking at houses too," she said loudly enough to carry. "I'm going to get one much bigger than this. With a pool." I couldn't help myself. I walked back inside. "Really? That's interesting. What job are you planning to buy it with?" Sarah's face flushed. "I have prospects." "Prospects aren't paychecks," I said. "And last I heard, you were still living off your dad's credit card." Robert's face turned that familiar shade of purple. "How dare you?" "No, how dare you?" I cut him off. "You show up uninvited to my house and then stand there insulting it?" "Lucy," Mom grabbed Robert's arm as he took a step forward. "Come on, Robert, Sarah. We're leaving." I watched them hurry out, Mom shooting me an apologetic look over her shoulder. The door closed behind them, and the party continued. 3 months after the housewarming disaster, my boss called me into his office with an opportunity one couldn't refuse, leading a major project in Boston. It would mean several months away, but it could fast-track my career to senior management. My biggest concern was my house, particularly my indoor garden. I'd spent months cultivating my collection of plants, delicate orchids, temperamental peace lilies, and my pride and joy, a rare bird of paradise that had just started to bloom. Each one needed specific care, and I couldn't bear the thought of returning to dead plants. After considering my options, I swallowed my pride and drove to Mom's house. We hadn't spoken much since the housewarming incident, but I knew she had a green thumb. Thankfully, she was alone when I arrived. "Lucy," she seemed surprised to see me on her doorstep. "Is everything okay?" "I need a favor," I said, following her into the kitchen. "I'm going to Boston for a few months for work. Could you look after my house?" "Mainly the plants, they need regular watering and care." Mom's face lit up. "Of course, you know how much I love gardening." I handed her the spare keys, along with detailed care instructions for each plant. The next few months were intense, but rewarding. 16-hour days, working with teams across multiple time zones, but the project was going well. I called Mom every week to check on things. "Everything's fine," she'd say. "Your plants are thriving, don't worry so much. Just focus on your work." I should have noticed how she always seemed to be at my house when I called, no matter what time it was. I should have picked up on the background noises, dishes clinking, TV sounds, things that shouldn't have been there if she was just stopping by to water plants. But I was too absorbed in my work to notice these red flags. Finally, after 4 months, the project wrapped up successfully. I caught a late flight home, exhausted but proud of what I'd accomplished. The Uber dropped me off at my house just after midnight. All I could think about was a hot shower and my own bed. I inserted my key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, more carefully this time. Still nothing. The key that had worked perfectly for months suddenly didn't fit. What the hell? I muttered, trying again. That's when I heard it, footsteps inside my house. My house. Moving around like they belonged there. My heart started racing as I pulled out my phone, fingers hovering over 911. Before I could dial, the door swung open. And there, standing in my doorway, wearing pajamas like she owned the place, was Sarah. Her blonde hair was pulled up in a messy bun, and she had the audacity to look annoyed at my presence. "What are you doing here?" The words came out in a whisper, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. "What am I doing here?" Sarah's smile was smug. "Living, of course. Been here for weeks now. Daddy helped me move in while you were gone playing big shot businesswoman in Boston." I stood there, my suitcase still in hand, trying to process her words. The exhaustion from my flight disappeared, replaced by a surge of anger. "This is my house," I said through gritted teeth. "Get out, now." Sarah leaned against my doorframe, and examined her manicured nails. "Yeah, that's not happening. I'm quite comfortable here. The master bathroom has amazing water pressure, by the way. Get out of my house." Each word was sharp enough to cut. Sarah's response was to laugh, actually laugh, and slam the door in my face. I heard the lock click, followed by her footsteps walking away. I stood there on my own front porch, surrounded by my luggage, trembling with rage. The garden lights I'd installed illuminated the flower beds I'd so carefully planned. Through the window, I could see my living room, but it wasn't my living room anymore. Sarah's jacket was thrown over my couch, her shoes scattered on my hardwood floors. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and called Mom. She picked up on the third ring, sounding groggy. "Lucy, what's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I almost screamed. "I just got home to find Sarah living in my house. She says she's been here for weeks. Tell her to get out right now, or I'm calling the police." No, don't call the police." Mom's voice went from sleepy to panicked. "We're coming over. Just wait there." "Where else am I supposed to go?" I snapped. "I'm locked out of my own house." The next 30 minutes were the longest of my life. I paced back and forth on my front porch, watching lights come on in neighboring houses. What must they think, seeing me out here in the middle of the night? A few cars drove by slowly, probably wondering if they should call the police themselves. Finally, Mom's car pulled up, Robert behind the wheel. They rushed out, both still in their pajamas under their coats. "What is going on?" I demanded, confronting Mom. "Why does Sarah have keys to my house? Why are you letting her live here?" Mom at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Lucy, honey, Sarah needed a place to stay. Her lease was up, and she couldn't afford the rent increase. Your house was just sitting empty." "Just sitting empty? It's my house. You had no right." "The girl needed somewhere to live," Mom said, as if that explained everything. "Your house is too big for just one person anyway." "We thought." "We?" I cut her off. "There is no we when it comes to my house. You were supposed to water my plants, not move your stepdaughter in." I watched my mother's face, waiting for some sign of understanding, some acknowledgement of how completely she had betrayed my trust. Instead, she just stood there, making excuses for the inexcusable. Robert stepped forward, his chest puffed out like it had been when I was 16. "Look, there was no point telling you about Sarah moving in. You would have just said no." Of course I would have said no. I was almost screaming now. "It's my house. And now I can't go in there." "The locks needed changing anyway," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "They were old. I did you a favor." I stared at him in disbelief. You do realize that's illegal, right? You can't just change the locks on someone else's property. Legal, illegal, he scoffed. It's done now. Sarah needs a place to stay, and this house is too big for just you. Get her out, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Get her out right now, or I'm calling the police. Robert's face twisted into that familiar smirk, the one he'd worn when I was a teenager, the one that said he knew he'd win. You won't do that. Lucy, Mom stepped forward, wringing her hands. If you call the police, that's it. I won't speak to you again. Is that what you want? To destroy this family completely? I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. This family? You mean the one where you let your husband illegally take over my house? That family? Instead of responding, they turned and walked into my house, leaving me standing there with my luggage. The door closed behind them with a definitive click. My hands weren't shaking anymore as I pulled out my phone. No more hesitation. No more trying to keep the peace. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report an illegal occupancy. Someone's changed the locks on my house and moved in without my permission. 20 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up, lights flashing. The neighbors were definitely awake now, watching from behind their curtains as I explained the situation to Officers Martinez and Chen. You're the legal owner? Officer Martinez asked. I pulled up the property records on my phone. Yes, I have all the documentation. I've been away on business, and I gave my mother a key to water my plants. Instead, they moved my stepsister in and changed all the locks. Officer Chen rang the doorbell. There was a long pause, shuffling sounds from inside. Finally, the door opened. Mom, Robert, and Sarah stood there, trying to look confident but failing. Good evening, Officer Martinez said. We need to see some identification and proof of residency from everyone. There's been a misunderstanding, Robert said, his voice oily smooth. Lucy gave permission for Sarah to stay here. They had a falling out, and now she's trying to cause trouble. That's a lie, I cut in. I never gave permission. They took advantage while I was away on business. Ask them about the locks, they'll admit they changed them without my knowledge. The old locks were faulty, Robert started. So you acknowledge changing the locks without the homeowner's permission? Officer Chen interrupted, making notes. Sarah stepped forward, her earlier smugness replaced by fear. Daddy said it would be okay. He said Lucy wouldn't mind once she got used to the idea. Sir, changing locks on someone else's property and occupying their home without permission constitutes illegal entry, Officer Martinez said, looking directly at Robert. We're going to have to take you and your daughter to the station. I watched in silence as the officers led them to the patrol car. Sarah looked smaller somehow, younger, like that 10-year-old girl who'd first walked into my life. Robert's face was purple with rage, but for once, he kept his mouth shut. Mom stood on the porch, trembling. As the patrol car pulled away, she turned to me with such hatred in her eyes that I almost took a step back. From this day forward, she said, her voice shaking, you are no longer my daughter. How could you do this to your own family? I felt strangely calm as I looked at her, this woman who had chosen everyone else over me for the past 12 years. Mom, I said quietly, you made it clear a long time ago that they were your real family. The day Sarah destroyed my research and you sat there in silence. The day Robert called me names and you looked away. Every time you asked me to be the bigger person while they treated me like dirt. You chose them. Over and over and over again. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Without another word, she walked to her car and drove away. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room, surrounded by Sarah's things, designer clothes thrown over my furniture, her photos stuck to my fridge, her toiletries cluttering my bathroom. In the morning, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed. The police called later that day. They wanted to know if I would press charges. No, I said after a long pause. Just make sure they understand they're not allowed on my property again. I hired a cleaning service to pack up Sarah's belongings and had them delivered to Mom's house. Then I spent a weekend cleaning every inch of my home, erasing all traces of their presence. Most of my plants had died from neglect, even the bird of paradise was brown and withered. I threw them all out and started fresh. That was 3 months ago. Mom tried calling once, but I didn't pick up. Robert sent a threatening email about suing me for Sarah's emotional distress, which I forwarded to my lawyer without responding. Sarah posted some vague social media rants about toxic people who pretend to be victims, but I blocked her accounts. Last week, I ran into Aunt Paula at the grocery store. She tried to tell me that Mom was struggling with our estrangement, that I should reach out, try to make peace. Some bridges, I told her, need to stay burned. I'm sleeping better these days. My new plants are thriving in the sunlight that streams through my windows. Dad and Grandma call regularly from Hawaii, and I'm planning to visit them next month. Sometimes I catch myself reaching for the phone to call Mom, out of habit more than anything else. But then I remember that night on my porch, locked out of my own home, and the urge passes.